Welcome to the Authority File. I'm Bill Mickey, your host and the editorial director at Choice. For this four-part series, my guests and I are discussing a topic we've been hearing a lot about. What will the workplace look like and behave like in a post-COVID environment? The obvious catalyst here is working remotely, which has been a lifesaver for some and an enormous challenge for others. Yet if we dig deeper, we discover that any kind of transformation, and I'm using air quotes here, may be a myth, as many industries actually try to get back to some version of a pre-pandemic normal. Plus, our new working arrangements across all industries have exposed a host of inequities across socioeconomic backgrounds. And what does this all mean for students who will soon be entering the workforce? How should we be preparing them, even as we navigate changes in our own workplace? Higher educational environments are also working environments, after all. Joining me for this discussion will be Dr. Cynthia Clark, Professor of Management at Bentley University, Dr. Gwendolyn Combs, Associate Professor of Management, College of Business at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, Dr. Hari Rajagopalan, Dean of the School of Business and Eugene A. Fallon, Junior Professor of Management at Francis Marion University, and Dr. Rhonda Sharpe, President of the Women's Institute for Science, Equity, and Race. In this third episode of this series, which is sponsored by Sage Publishing, we talk about how business education is handling these developments that are influenced by the pandemic and, even before that, the broader social movements. As we look at how higher education needs to change and how they're preparing students for a changing workplace. I want to just move on to the next question and look at, I'm glad we've had this conversation on sort of characterizing research in this context, because I want to get some perspective on all of you in terms of how business education, itself is kind of dealing with these developments that are influenced by the pandemic and or broader social movements. How are institutions preparing students for a workplace where they either have more agency to influence change for themselves, drive it from the top down, or bring their own talents into an organization's efforts. What changes are we seeing within business education to help students in that regard? And Hari, I'll start with you on this one.
Okay. Well, one of the concerns I've had about what society is asking of universities in general, and more with like applied areas like business and engineering, is this there seems to be a split between asking for skill-based training and then educating the student for the jobs of tomorrow. And they are two very different things, and the requirements and resources are very different. So, and I'll give you an example of using programming, because I have some background there. Is if a student goes through a computer science or MIS program and comes out as a good programmer, what we are saying is he may not know that specific program that you're asking for, like Ruby or Python or C++ or Java, but give him a computer, give him Google or her. I apologize, that was gender bias right there. I'm getting old and I have to retrain myself, So they will pick up the next language because while the syntax may be different, the semantics is the same. But unfortunately, we are under a lot more pressure from industries to say, I need a student who knows Tableau or Power BI. This is the data analytics, right? And that's really the job of industries to train them. Companies used to train their employees in specific skills they need. And I think that's one of the issues, movements, the pressures business education particularly is dealing with. Are we going to train them to learn for jobs of tomorrow, or are we going to focus on specific skill-based training for the immediate jobs of today? And I think that is then compounded by some more of these social movements which need to be handled in business education. An example is the appreciation for diversity. And we had a very specific issue where a company came to us and talked about how not only that their customer base is very heterogeneous and varied, but their employee base is also widespread and varied, and they were facing issues. They understand that the need to have that kind of diversity, but they were having a whole bunch of human resource issues and problems because of that diversity, and they were not sure how to handle that. So I mean, how are we handling it? That's a very good question. Because we were already strained by the first set of forces, and now we have this additional responsibility. I think that's a good question for business education. I'm not sure I have an answer for it.
Mm-hmm.
It's something we are struggling. I know AACSB is struggling with it from an accrediting body, and it's a conversation that is going on.
Yep. Cynthia, how about you? Are you seeing the same struggle?
Yeah, I think we're at an inflection point in higher ed because I don't think we prepare students for the workforce of tomorrow. In the words of Wayne Gretzky, you need to skate where the puck is going, right? We are, in this sense, some of us are revising curriculum, which I think is good, yet with accreditation bodies, AACSB, well, they've forced standardization. And so changes to your curriculum are very hard, and we're not nimble enough to be able to change in a university setting. It's very, very slow change in higher ed, typically. And so colleges, I think, will continue to have to make classroom experiences directly applicable to the real world, which means that professors need to understand where their industry is going, and they need to engage themselves with practitioners to understand where that puck is going. So we need to get on that yesterday, in my opinion, in my humble opinion. And so we also need to, at the same time, I think, imprint upon students that yes, change is slow in higher ed, but change is slow, period. And that, they maybe have to wait to be in a position to make a change. Still, having said that, I think there are ways to voice your values, right? Ask a question, provide data, reframe an issue. These are ways that you can work within your environment being a new person. I mean, we really help them at the beginning of their careers, and then effectively it's their learning, their reputation, their decision making, right? I think a lot of it is on the professors themselves and the knowledge base they have, which in fact and in reality don't have. It's the students managing the expectations of what it's really like, and the connection between the professor and the student, right? So I would say lots of changes afoot. I think the pandemic, certainly these global social movements were a wake-up call to what universities are not doing. So a note on that real quick. I really think that we are also at an inflection point with research. We don't research things that have social impact. Sometimes there's no managers in our management research, right? The data is not based on managers. We need to get out there, but of course that's incumbent upon you or me or all of us to have professional connections, which take years to develop. And so our research is being read by one another, and that is the currency, not whether our research has impact to managers.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Rhonda, I want to jump.
Yeah, I do want to jump in because I think that as I'm listening to this conversation, I feel like there's an important group that's missing, and that's parents. So I'm going to stick with the sports analogy that Cynthia offered, because I was just talking to someone about this the other day. I used to teach sports economics, and we talk about, which is what Hari said, specific skills versus transferable. So I know how to code. That is a transferable skill. The language is specific. So I think that what we have done with higher ed is higher ed has transformed from being this place where students came to learn, to get skills that they could apply across. Higher ed has now come to become this place where you get a skill to get a job. And that to me is what this conversation is about when we're talking about preparing people for the workplace. We're preparing folks to get a job. Education is supposed to train you to think. It's supposed to train you to learn. And that should mean that you can get a job, right? That's what that should mean. But we should be training people how to think, how to learn. And in that conversation, I'm going to dare say that is also tiered, right? That there are going to be your elite spaces where these conversations are different. There is more space for students to have conversations about thinking, learning, transferring their skills. And then there are spaces where it is really clear you need to train my kid to get a job. So I think as we're having this conversation, we're forgetting about parents and we're forgetting that, and maybe I shouldn't have said transform, maybe the better is that the role of higher education, I think, has really changed. I think most of us are roughly the same age. And it's not to say that we didn't come to college with an understanding that we would get skills to get a job. We definitely did. And when Hare made the comment about you should be able to teach yourself a different language, I can remember being a master's student and having someone tell me by definition of having a master's meant I could teach myself anything. I was just like, wait, what? I was like, wait a minute. Because, but it stuck with me. I thought he was wrong, but I understood that. I also think in higher ed, we don't do that. We are bringing young folks in, and what they understand is I need to get an A because an A means I'm eligible for this pool. I get an A, it means the teacher's going to be willing to write me a recommendation. We're not asking folks to come in and, I think Cynthia said it, question. Right? There isn't space for questioning, and not necessarily some of this to their fault, right? It's not their fault. The students that they're teaching now are No Child Left Behind. They're being trained literally in their education that here's the information, here's what's on the test, and you probably have seen it. If God forbid you give them something on an exam that you haven't covered, woo, that's new. Right? We've got a different generation of folks. It's a different role, and we cannot forget the expectation of parents. It's not just students. It's not employers, but there's also the expectation of parents that make what higher ed does far more complicated, and it's tiered.
To add on I think it's true. How can we ask students to challenge themselves when we aren't challenging them? And I think that the parents, you bring that up, Rhonda, I agree with you, but I think it's also the parents who have been the most critical of higher ed during the pandemic. And it should be a wake-up call. And I like what you're trying to marry, which is the real practical need to educate these kids to get a position, a starting position, but also at the same time to educate them to think, as I was saying, to question, to provide data, how to be this person who voices their values in an atmosphere where, they're the junior person, right? How do they think through something? How do they make others think through something? Right? By teeing up a question. So I think this is a really important part of this conversation today is this role that we play, the role that SAGE plays, right? In the higher ed atmosphere, the role that all of us play and the parents and the students as well. And I think it could very well be an exciting wake-up call for higher ed if we choose to let it.
I agree that the idea of teaching students, or the idea that students should be able to leave our institutions being critical thinkers, being persons who can, articulate an idea and who can provide data and information to support that articulation, whether it's wrong or right, but provide information to support what they're saying, and have a way of professionally presenting that, so that people will listen to you, and people will have a tendency to then have a discussion with you regarding your idea. I've always said that our larger society, we are microcosm of what the larger society is. So when we're going to talk about where we went wrong, our larger society dictates or asks for certain things, and that in order to be considered a viable participant, then regardless, you provide that. You provide that. So I think higher ed institutions have been sucked into that notion of we are providing a product for industry, for wherever, without really thinking about what that product is prepared to do or is able to do. So, so it's a step back from, quite a huge step back from, we are preparing students to be valuable contributors to society, to be able to, to critically think and to analyze and to debate and all those types of things, to preparing them for what the employer has asked for in the past, someone who can do X and someone who can do Y. Forget about all the other stuff. But then we hear from employers who say, well, when your students come to us, they don't think critically. They can't operate, on their feet. They can't, carry an idea. Well, we gave you what you asked us to give you. Yeah. So, we could do both in a sense, but one became the substitute for the other.
Yeah. Sorry.
Did anyone catch that Gwendolyn almost said our children?
Yeah. I'm at that age, all of them. Now, when you begin to teach the children of your previous students, that says something to you.
Bill, I'd like to add something here. If you look at, like how higher education, especially in the United States, and, I have a different background because I did my undergrad in India, has changed from, maybe the 1920s and 1930s, where who went to college?
Yeah.
And then in the 1950s and 60s, who went to college and the cost of college.
Absolutely.
Right? So you have to take that into account versus now. So we have a broader section of society going to college and the cost has increased. So the question is, yes, it's great. And I really think a good liberal arts education is necessary. It's important. Business education should talk about teaching students to think critically, communicate well, these very broad framework. But when the kid graduates with $30,000 in debt or $40,000 in debt, and basically says, the parent asks me, my son or daughter, first generation, nobody else has gone to college in my entire family, comes out with $40,000 in debt, what kind of job are they going to get? What are the skill sets they're going to have? And we need to have some answers for that, right? Otherwise, in Florence, that particular student could be a good electrician or a plumber and immediately start making money, right? And so the question is, if you are in a middle class or upper middle class environment, you can trip and fall and get up again and walk. Some of these kids, a vast majority of my students, have one chance.
Absolutely.
So if they don't graduate and then get a job immediately, and a decent paying job, that kind of really sinks them for life. And I saw that a lot in India. And when I grew up in India, we basically looked at being an engineer or a doctor. We had two choices. We didn't have a choice, right? And so I'm seeing this. If you look at the normal distribution, right? We used to get the best students going into college. Now we have a broader section. We have to educate a broader section of students. And second, also, they are coming from multiple socioeconomic backgrounds and financially, whether they're able to bear that burden, which is right now in debt. And so that's definitely an issue there.
Okay, so I want to push back on that because I'm going to absolutely disagree with you from this notion that it should only be the best students who are going
I'm
to
not
college.
saying it is the
No,
best.
he didn't say
That's
that.
not what
That's
I
not what
said.
he said.
What did you say about the normal distribution?
I just said it used to be.
Okay.
It used to be the elite who used to go to college. Now we have a broader section and we have to educate them. But when we educate them, it can't just be on critical thinking. We have to do that, but we also have to do that immediate after college. We have to make sure they do get a job, because with if they have 30,000 and 40,000 in debt and their parents can't pay that debt off, it really sinks them for life. And I see that with a lot of my students. And to get them that first job, they need some skills also.
Okay,
which is
so
why we've got to do both.
We're not going to have the student loan debt conversation because I am like so over that in terms of people, justifying that for many of the ways that we are teaching students and how we're approaching education in the job market. Because the reality is this: if you cannot make an investment in yourself, who do you make an investment in? I would also say that sometimes the issue isn't about the student loan debt or the first job. It is, do people understand how do you manage any of your debt? Not just student loan debt, but how do you manage any of your debt, right? Because you don't understand that, you're going to be screwed no matter what the debt is, right? So then I think the second part, coming back to something that Gwendolyn said about critical thinking skills, is, for me, I always ask the question, are we modeling that behavior in class, right? Are we creating a space where students can ask us questions? I once had a student at Bucknell who was, I'm happy to say, not in my class, but we were walking across campus and she said to me, she's like, I never understand, why is it faculty rush through the syllabus? Right? Like, we don't even get a chance to always understand a topic before we're on to something else. And she's like, sometimes the classes don't even build on the next, right? It's not a class that builds on something. And that has stuck with me, right? Because essentially what she's saying is, you're not even here to teach us. You don't even want us to get the information. It's the checking of the boxes. How many of us are coming in and we are lecturing as opposed to, maybe a mixture of lecture and a Socratic method? Are we modeling a space where students can question us, where they can engage us in conversation? They can share their ideas, because if we're not, there's no way in the world you can expect them, as Cynthia has said, to question when they're junior, because they're definitely junior to us, reframe, right, what their points of view are, and provide it with data. Most of us don't model that, because what we're terrified of is that you're going to get that student who's going to ask you that question that you don't have an answer to. And that was me as a junior faculty member, not knowing that I could be like, hey, excellent question, not the focus. Come see me in office hours, right? Which isn't dismissive. It says, happy to have that conversation, but it's not today's class. Right? We don't set that up because we are afraid for them to know that we might not have an answer for something. So you can't expect them to do that if we're not modeling it.
Right.
Yeah. And I won't say most, Rhonda. I know some do, but when I look at my colleagues, they are, and we are, I tell my students first year class, I might say something that you don't agree with. You can challenge me on that. I may say something that you don't understand. Challenge me on that. We can have a debate. We can have a conversation, as long as it's done respectfully in the class. And, I see that with my colleagues, but I do understand what you're saying. And I think that sometimes that comes from this, this mission of the instructor, that 3-prong, research, teaching, and service. You never hear teaching, service, and research. It's usually research is first, teaching is second, and service is third. And
teaching is first.
Teaching is
not first. At Francis Marion, teaching is first.
And we have some
and
people
it has
who
to
are
be more than a lecture. Like Rhonda said, it has to be more than a lecture.
So we have, and a lot of schools have, especially, Big Ten kind of research one institutions, we have two tiers, and I mean 2 tiers of faculty. We have teaching faculty and we have research faculty. So teaching faculty are encouraged to get all of the training and all of this stuff in terms about how to teach, where the research faculty are not necessarily, in that sphere. So some. So, when you set the goal, when you set the objective, that determines what people do in their classrooms. And I have heard some people actually say to junior faculty, don't spend a lot of time on teaching, because in order to get tenure here, you got to have the research, and the research has to be in certain places, and it has to be said, da, 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 da. So when people get tenured, they use that model to get tenured. But when they get tenured, nobody goes back to them and say, okay, now you need to work on teaching. Nobody does that. So they take that model all the way to, the end of their service in the institution. But so it's not both of them are equal. It's one is more important than the other. And I think both of them are equal. If my student is in the classroom, I don't want a teacher to tell my student, well, I don't have time to do this because, I have a research project that I have to work on. Yeah, you do, but you also need to teach my student.
You just heard from Dr. Cynthia Clark, Professor of Management at Bentley University, Dr. Gwendolyn Combs, Associate Professor of Management, College of Business at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, Dr. Hari Rajagopalan, Dean of the School of Business and Eugene A. Fallon, Junior Professor of Management at Francis Marion University, and Dr. Rhonda Sharpe, President of the Women's Institute for Science, Equity, and Race. Sage Publishing is the sponsor of this 4-part series of The Authority File. Join us next week for the final episode of this series when we talk about equitable change. In other words, during an era of profound constructive change, how do we ensure it impacts everyone as equally as possible, both in higher education and in the workforce?
I've enjoyed teaching Zoom. What I have found with Zoom is chat. Students send messages in chat. With chat, if you're watching a student, rather than calling them out, you can send them a message and say, hey, I see your camera's off. Hey, I see you're not focused. Like, are you okay? And if the person says, no, I'm not, like such and such is going on, you can literally say to them, then why don't you drop off? I do ask my students, if you've got 5 minutes, can you just hang back? Because again, in the virtual world, they're not really going anyplace. Like, they don't have to go across campus, right? They just log out and log into another space.
If you like what you hear, rate us or give us a review on your podcast platform of choice. As always, sponsorship and advertising for the Authority File podcast are handled by Choice's advertising manager, Pam Marino, and all of our episodes are produced by Choice's senior digital media producer, Mark Dirks, and digital media assistant, Sabrina Kofer. That's all for this week. Thanks for joining us.